hit, ball's out. Recovered by Timmons. Ryan Clark is still down.
There's also a report out from the Journal of the American Medical Association about former football players and CTE.
Manning up the seam. Incomplete. Oh, no. Oh, Collie is down again. Oh, no.
When the topic is concussions, injuries to the human brain, it is more important to understand what we do not know.
Garoppolo 12 of 19 in this half. Oh, my goodness. Goodwin just got unloaded upon by Blake Countess.
Essentially, a doctor diagnosed 210 football players, and diagnosed 177 of them with some form of CTE.
He'll get a shot at it. Whoa! Helmet's out, ball's out. Oh, my. And Josh Cribbs is probably out.
I think the least surprising part of this story is that it's not surprising at all.
Was talking on the sideline the whole time, it seemed like, to Vontez perfect, and yes.
Oh, my goodness.
And if they play this game, they are taking a risk with their brain. We know that.
And now Ben with a deep drop, buying time, extending the play as he has been doing for years, and that pass is incomplete, and Miller really takes a shot.
And that's helmet to helmet. You could hear it up here, I think.
Right.
How many times are you talk about whether it's a reaction or overreaction? Whether it's Russell Wilson or Tom Savage or Jacoby Brissett or Cam, every week we talk about this.
That means it's wrong.
It's enough.
Yep. You're right.
But there's the handoff to Ridley. He's hit it. He's laid out. The ball is out. He was robbed by Pollard.
Football is associated with CTE.
How's it going? I'm here today to talk about chronic traumatic encephalopathy, otherwise known as CTE. CTE is a progressive degenerative disease of the brain commonly found in football athletes. CTE is caused from repetitive hits or blows to the head over time, otherwise known as concussions. A concussion is a mild traumatic brain injury as a result from blows to the head. Now, a concussion is when the brain ricochets or moves rapidly inside the skull. And these hits to the brain over time can cause the brain to stretch and elongate, which ultimately leads to a buildup of the protein tau, which is commonly found in Alzheimer's disease. So, some of the symptoms of CTE and Alzheimer's are very similar with each other in nature. And a lot of the symptoms of CTE don't start to form until about 8 to 10 years after repetitive brain injuries have occurred. A decade later, this can be an issue because you have athletes that don't realize what is stemming from these problems they're having. All these hits to the head will later contribute to the permanent brain damage they now suffer from. So some of the symptoms of CTE include, but are not limited to, memory loss, depression, confusion, and impulsiveness. And a lot of these side effects can cause us to communicate differently. We talk differently, we think differently, and in turn, we're going to act differently than we used to before we had this brain damage. And a lot of athletes are not able to communicate the same way. A lot of these symptoms in Alzheimer's are very much present in CTE. Now, dementia is another disease that has a lot of similarities with CTE, much like Alzheimer's. The only difference between CTE and Alzheimer's and dementia is more commonly, people that are diagnosed with Alzheimer's or dementia are diagnosed later in life, typically 65 and up, whereas CTE is being found in athletes 40 years and younger. There is a significant age gap between a 65-year-old with Alzheimer's and a 35-year-old with CTE. Some scientists even say that CTE can be found in young adults and young athletes. So if you would look at college athletes, a lot of college athletes are between 18 to 22 years of age, where the brain is still cognitively developing, and they're suffering from this damage at such a young age. It's going to permanently hinder them for the rest of their lives. And that is brain dissection.
Baby. Right on, baby. There you go. Woo. During a 20-year career,
Junior Seau took countless brutal hits, one of the best linebackers of his generation. But today, a grim footnote to that Hall of Fame career.
NFL great Junior Seau, 43 years old, dead of a gunshot wound to the chest. His mother in shock tonight. And his football colleagues are asking, is this somehow another example of that legacy of the punishment players take on the field?
Junior Seau was a very well-respected and well-loved athlete in the NFL. He predominantly played for the San Diego Chargers as a linebacker in the 1990s. And unfortunately, back in 2012, took his own life from a gunshot wound to the chest. Now, he shot himself in the chest so his brain could still be evaluated by scientists. After his death, in an interview with his son and ex-wife, they talked about how he would have mood swings and uncontrollable fits of anger, and they never knew why. And this is how CTE affected him when he was alive. He may not have known he had CTE, but he knew there was an issue, and they knew it too. And upon examination after his death, he did test positive for CTE. And unfortunately, at the moment, it's not possible to diagnose someone living with CTE. It can only be done posthumous during an autopsy where they examine the body and the brain. And because of this, it causes a lot of ignorance among most people. Most people believe because you can't be diagnosed with it while living, it doesn't exist because you can't see it. And as we know, that's just not true. Despite what we know, athletes still risk their lives and minds and bodies to play football, knowing the long-term effects that come with it. The average NFL career is just under 3.5 years. So not every athlete is Tom Brady or Peyton Manning or Larry Fitzgerald, and they just can't play for decades on decades on decades. It just doesn't happen. Their bodies don't allow them, and a lot of times their skill depletes as they get older. So you have just under 3.5 years in the NFL for most people. Now, in these 3.5 years, you have as much time as you can to make as much money possible before you get out of the league. Unfortunately, that money doesn't always stick around, but the long-term health effects of CTE are permanent. So this ultimately begs the question, is it worth permanent brain damage for a few years in the spotlight and a couple $1 million?